Welcome back to your extremely rigorous lessons in British architectural history from the dawn of time right up to the present day. I've got a mental leaderboard in my mind about who's in first, second and third place, but I won't reveal it to the end. A few new people have come this week, welcome. Anyone who wanted revision, Amelia very kindly videoed the first, 3/4 of an hour of last week, which will give you the basics of classical architecture, which you all know inside out. What are the three Greek classical orders in their chronological order?
Doric, Ionic,
Corinthian, geniuses. What is the only Roman? Unbelievable. And what is the only Renaissance? Unbelievable. And last week we almost finished. We did the Norman stroke Romanesque, but we also did the three periods of English Gothic architecture. What was the first one? Unbelievable, 100%. And what were the dates of early English, roughly speaking? Fantastic. And what was the second period? Incredible. What were the period? What was the dates of that? And the third period? Oh, incredible. And what were again the rough dates of that?
1350 to about 1500.
Yeah, it's around 1530, but it actually bleeds late into the 16th century. So I hope the people who are new today are absolutely terrified by the genius of your fellow brilliant professors. But so we got as far as the perpendicular Gothic period. And here, in fact, the fantastic cloisters at Norwich Cathedral from 1361 might be familiar to you or your children or your parents or your grandchildren or your grandparents as appeared in Harry Potter. And some of the giveaways to perpendicular Gothic are these fantastic spreading fan vaults. Showing, as I was saying last week, that through that whole period of Gothic architecture from 1150 to the 16th century, they got better and better at the engineering, so they could have vast walls like this, largely built of glass, which obviously isn't structurally so good, but they'd worked out the pointed arch. And the thing about a fan vault, as well as supporting the roof above it, it also, you can see, it's got a huge amount of, this is stone added on, so it's having to support the stone ornamentation hanging off the vaults, so showing how incredibly strong they've got at their vaults. And the other giveaway to perpendicular architecture is these huge windows. These, because very early on in the perpendicular period, 1361, just at the beginning, it doesn't quite satisfy that rule. Do you remember what the strips of stone going up are called? Mullions, fantastic. It's a good rule of thumb, but not always true, isn't true here, that the mullions go all the way from the bottom to the top, but they don't here because this is still a hangover from that decorated Gothic period where you get very complicated, what's the name for this stone? Tracery at the top. So this is a good transitional point from decorated to perpendicular. Next slide, please. These are the fantastic fan vaults at King's College, Cambridge, built in 1530. You can see this incredible, beautiful spreading fans here. It's taken at an angle so you can't quite see the fantastic perpendicular windows, but I hope you can see the incredible amount of light. Do you remember early on when we saw those lovely but rather primitive Anglo-Saxon churches which had tiny windows in them, so obviously that much darker inside. So perpendicular Gothic churches and cathedrals are massively light, and there's a theory as to why the perpendicular Gothic period was the only one of the Gothic periods that the British invented, is because we could afford to have all this light. If you had this in a southern Spanish or southern Italian cathedral, you'd all roast to death, but that's pure conjecture. Next slide, please. That's the outside, the lovely front of King's College, Cambridge, taken from the river along the backs, and you can see there's a very good example. Massive window, practically filling up the whole of the facade there, and there the mullions go soaring straight from the bottom to the top. This is right at the end of the perpendicular Gothic period, where you're getting the pure perpendicular Gothic. Next slide, please. And this is the Henry VII Chapel at the far east end of Westminster Abbey, built by Henry VIII for his father Henry VII in the 1510s, and that's the reason why, despite dissolving the monasteries, he didn't smash up Westminster Abbey just down the road from here, because that was where Daddy was buried. And you can see here, this not only has these lovely spreading fan vaults, it even has vaults hanging down. These are called pendant vaults, again in stone, completely incredible. That's extra added weight added onto the ceiling, and yet it's still supported with perpendicular Gothic behind. Again, mullions going straight from the bottom to the top. Next slide, please. And that's the outside of the Henry VII Chapel at the far east end of Westminster Abbey. You can see there the same perpendicular Gothic windows, and it's this building particularly that when the Houses of Parliament burnt down in 1834, there was a competition to build the replacement, and the stipulation was that it should be in the style of the revered building across the road, perpendicular Gothic. So that's why the Houses of Parliament are built in, the 1834 building are built in perpendicular Gothic, even though we'll come on to it later today. Pugin, the great man who built it, actually preferred decorated, but he was told he had to build in the style of the revered abbey across the road. And so that quite often people will come and look at Parliament and they won't take in the building that inspired it across the road. Next slide, please. So there it is. There is Parliament. In the perpendicular Gothic style, you can see just incredible vertical axis of the whole thing of these. They aren't quite mullions, but you can see these straight lines soaring straight from the bottom to the top. We'll come on to this, but it was done by Pugin, the arch-Gothicist, with Sir Charles Barry, who was actually a classicist, so that's why, classical architect, that's why Barry made it incredibly symmetrical. But every single detail, as Graham here, former MP, will testify, is designed in 1834 building inside by Pugin, who was an obsessive Gothicist. Next slide, please. And this is the Divinity School in Oxford, also built in the early 16th century, so another perpendicular Gothic. And you can see again, to get a feel for these incredibly heavy pendant vaults down there, and flooded with light at the same time. Next slide, please. And that's the roof of the Divinity School at Oxford. And it's a very good example. These are the walls I'm standing on one wall, as it were. There's another wall there. And the ribs of the vault spring from each side. And can anyone remind me what those are called? Those little vaults, ribs which aren't connected to the bottom. Lierne, brilliant, Lierne vault. So that's showing through the period, the English Gothic period, from 1150 to 1530, the vaults get more and more complicated, and one of the complicating factors are Lierne vaults, which don't spring all the way from the wall to the bosses in the middle. You can see these bosses are all where the different ribs meet. Fantastically beautiful, very complex design. Next slide, please. And this is the tomb of Henry VII and his wife Margaret of Richmond. And what we'll be seeing at the end of this perpendicular Gothic period, again, it's not a precise date, is the beginning of the arrival of classicism. I hope you can see how incredibly realistic those effigies are. And they were designed by an Italian artist and architect called Pietro Torrigiano. Can I have the next slide, please? Who was a Renaissance artist and architect from Florence, and in fact, he'd even been at school with Michelangelo, and he even got in a fight with him and broke his nose. It's not clear why, perhaps because he was slightly jealous of Michelangelo's genius, but actually it's wonderful. People don't often go and look at the actual tomb of Henry VII, far at the far end of Westminster Abbey, but it is sudden not to do down earlier Gothic sculpture, but you can see this Putto is extremely realistic and Renaissance. You wouldn't be surprised to see it in 15th century Florence. There's the next slide, please. That is Torrigiano, his nose intact, Michelangelo's not. Next slide, please. And that is, so we're just beginning to get the beginnings of classicism in the 16th century. So you've had those three periods of Gothic architecture, and they start to overlap with beautiful classicism, but none of the people doing this, apart from actual Italians like Torrigiano, have actually been to Italy, so they produced their own sort of form of British classicism in the 16th century. And this is the ceiling of Cardinal Wolsey's closet in Hampton Court in the early 16th century. And those lozenges are a very classical device, but at the same time, I don't know if it's got the Tudor rose there, it still has an English feel to it. Next slide, please. And that is the showing how you're having this overlap between the Gothic and the classical. That is the Great Hall, as it says, Tudor Great Hall at Hampton Court, built by Henry VIII in the 1530s, and that's extremely like that hammer beam roof that we saw at Westminster Hall, which was late 14th century. So they're still using the engineering of Gothic roofs. The hammer beam, remember, was the little horizontal beam there and there and there, which literally narrows the span of the hall. So the you're getting this moment, magical moment, transitional moment in the 16th century, where you're still having Gothic perpendicular window again there, and you're getting the arrival of classical features. Next slide, please. So that's the gatehouse to St James's Palace. Literally, if you go out the door, go right again, bottom of the hill. Again, built for Henry VIII, who was a great builder as well as a basher up of buildings. He's built buildings he wanted to live in, and that's again 1530s by Henry VIII. And it's got all the it's got perpendicular Gothic windows with mullions going straight up, but it's what's it reminiscent of? A castle, yeah. So it's in fact a gatehouse to a grand palace. It was in fact originally a leper hospital, St James's. We get the name St James's. It was a religious foundation, a leper hospital. And at this stage, the kingdom is at peace. So you're not using these features, the crenellations, the great castle gatehouse, for defensive reasons. If you go out there at lunchtime or when we leave today, you'll see the walls on either side are very low. It wouldn't work as a castle, but they're still borrowing castle devices, but purely for pleasure. Next slide, please. That's a longer view. That's the bottom of the gatehouse. And that's the window at the end of the Chapel Royal, part of the same complex built by Henry VIII. In fact, on the other side of that window is where Queen Victoria got married to Prince Albert, and you can see that's a classic massive perpendicular Gothic window, the mullions soaring straight up. Again, crenellations, but just for friendly reasons. And if you were building a castle, you wouldn't build a window that big. In fact, 20 or 30 years ago, before the king became the king, a few tourists broke into Prince Charles's window on that side and had the cheek to steal his cufflinks, but very easy to break into. Next slide, please. That's the perpendicular Gothic windows at St James's Palace, close up. Next slide, please. And so you're beginning to get classicism. Just get the date right. This one. This is Kirby Hall in Northamptonshire, built in 1575, and you're beginning to get classical features. So what are the flattened pillars called here? Pilasters. Very, very beautiful they are too. But you're still using so-called strap work, a device that comes from Northern Europe, particularly from the Netherlands, which was originally made out of leather and then became decorative. Here it is turned into stone, and it's plastered or carved all over the pilasters. Now, a Roman architect or a Greek architect would have been horrified at this. So you get this period in the 16th century where you're still holding on to the old Northern European Gothic decorative devices, and they're beginning to get the hang of classical architecture. But yes.
As he became defender of the faith, therefore head of the church, was that the impetus to have a church Gothic sort of architectural style?
I don't think so. I think it was very much the style across everything. So it applied to noblemen as well. So he just had the money to build in that style, which was the fashion. Next slide, please. And that's Kirby Hall too. You can see incredible proliferation of classical motifs coming into England, which are very, very beautiful, but Vitruvius would have been horrified in Rome 1500 years earlier. But you're getting this wonderful, there's a lovely perpendicular Gothic window, this overlap between Gothic and classical in the 16th century, all building up to a man we'll see in a second, Inigo Jones, in the early 17th century, who becomes the first properly classical British architect. Next slide, please. So that's Longleat in Wiltshire, which was built in, 1572. Again, from a distance like this, it looks quite like a medieval Gothic palace. But close up, it's got all the pilasters, Doric, Ionic. I don't think there is one on there. There is Corinthian, articulating the facade. Getting closer and closer to the correct classicism. There would have been pattern books that the architects could have looked at, but the architects hadn't actually been to Italy, unless there was someone like Torrigiano coming over here from Italy. Next slide, please. There's Longleat closer up. Again, sorry, don't quite see the pilasters, but great big perpendicular windows, the mullions soaring through the roof there, through the window. Next slide, please. And that's Wallerton Hall in Nottinghamshire, which is 1588 by a very influential man, Robert Smithson, who in his tomb just next door is the first British builder of buildings to have the word architectus in Latin written on his tomb. So only now in the late 16th century you actually have the term architect. You had brilliant designers before, brilliant masons who were geniuses, but the idea of having an overarching mind with a single named person it begins with Smithson. Smithson is spelt with a Y, and again from a distance this looks like a medieval, it even has castle elements to it, although none of it is for defensive purposes, but it is articulated with pilasters everywhere. So again, the transitional between Gothic and classical. Next slide, please. And that's the plan of Wallerton, which again could look like a castle plan with towers on the outside, but it is all one of these great treasure houses of the 16th century as Queen Elizabeth takes over and the kingdom is at peace and is very, very rich. These rich noblemen can pour money into decoration and beauty rather than the huge castles of the medieval period. Next slide, please. And this is Hardwicke Hall in Derbyshire. It used to be owned by the Dukes of Devonshire, who owned this house. The current Duke's father had to sell it when his father died in the 40s and paid huge death duties. This was built for Elizabeth of Hardwicke in the late 16th century. And you can see here massive proliferation of perpendicular Gothic windows. Tiny bit of classicism here with a Doric arcade, so showing that overlap. It produced one of the least funny jokes in architectural history. People said at the time, Hardwicke Hall, more glass than wall. Very kind of you to laugh, but actually it did make a very good point that you could, just like those churches, the cathedrals, you could support this huge piles of masonry with walls that were very much glass. Next slide, please. And that's Burghley House, another great treasure house in Cambridgeshire, built in 1585. Looks quite like Wallerton. Again, from a distance, you might think it was a great bristling Gothic palace with pointed spires. You look closely, and there are pilasters articulating it in the late 16th century. Next slide, please. And that's inside Burghley House. That again, from a distance, you could be forgiven for thinking that's a Gothic spire, but again, you'll see these columns articulating it. So this is this lovely period of transitional period, where, as I said, a purist would get very angry and say this is all wrong, knock it down. But actually, it's a very pleasing and unusually British combination. Next slide, please. That is just down the road. Middle Temple Hall, one of the four Inns of Court, built in 1572. So just as this classicism is coming in, You've got these, as I say, piers don't come to a precise end, they bleed on from one period. So this is built very much like a medieval hall with attached buttresses here. Crenellations, again, a nod to being a castle, but it's not, there's no castle reason to it, no castle aspect to it at all. Perpendicular Gothic windows, and then it's got a Ionic doorway, and these cornerstones are called, anyone? Coins, brilliant. Quoins, which are a classical detail. So you're still got essentially perpendicular Gothic building, but with a tiny touch of classicism thrown in. Next slide, please. That's the fantastic screen at the kitchen end of the hall, which was bombed in the war, but has all been rebuilt. But showing how you're beginning to get this transition. You've got the hammer beam roof. There's the hammer beam there. You've got a perpendicular Gothic window. But this screen, sorry, it's not a very good slide, but that has all got classical pillars to it with an entablature above it, but it's completely covered in wood with this strap work from the Netherlands, from Northern Europe. So again, Vitruvius would have been horrified, but in 1572 you're getting this overlap. Gary and David, distinguished barristers, must have had many a dinner there. You're getting this overlap between classical and Gothic. Next slide, please.
It's a double hammer beam roof.
It's a double hammer beam, yeah, exactly, yeah. In fact, you might, next slide, sorry, Amelia, no, sorry, it's a bad slide, but exactly. So that means you can narrow the span of the building twice. There it is with a high table at the end. This is built on the style of a royal palace or a medieval palace. The raised dais would be where the king or the nobleman would sit. Or a bencher. Are you a bencher, Gary?
I am.
Yeah. So, well, Gary, you should be telling us all about it. Gary would normally be sitting about here, and
I'm near the gents.
and then you have normal barristers sitting lower down, and literally the lower down you go. Originally in a medieval palace, that's where the expression "below the salt" comes, because the salt was where the salt was. Very, very valuable. If you sat below the salt, right down here, you wouldn't get the salt. And this picture is taken from the Minstrels Gallery. So here is a building built in 1572, but based on medieval royal palaces going back 400 years before. Next slide.
I think all the portraits are Stuart, plus one Elizabethan.
All right. Well, I think between the three of you, what's the Elizabethan one?
Elizabeth I.
Oh, Elizabeth. Oh, right. Next slide, please. So this is Hatfield House in Hertfordshire, built in 1611. And again, you can see this is just about to get the arrival of Inigo Jones buildings, but still here is essentially a medieval perpendicular Gothic palace, but with classical details. You can't quite see it, but on the screen down there it's got classical details. But you can see medieval perpendicular Gothic windows wrapped all around. Next slide, please. That is the staircase at Hatfield, which again is covered with this strap work from the Netherlands and from Northern Europe, and this is showing you right up to the early 17th century when classicism arrives. Next slide, please. And this is a man, Inigo Jones, of Welsh extraction, but born in Smithfield, who is the first British architect to really, I touched on him last week, to really learn the rules of classical architecture inside out. He went on 2 grand tours with the Earl of Arundel to the Veneto, to Venice, to Rome, and as I said, he took with him, next slide please, the works of this man, Andrea Palladio, born in 1508, died in 1580, who wrote the great book in 1560, the 4 books of architecture, Quattro Libri dell'Architettura, which explain the rules of classical architecture, but also have pictures of ancient and Renaissance buildings. And as I said before, amazingly, Inigo Jones's copy of that book survives in Worcester College, Oxford, covered with his measurements, the ink is now turned brown, of Inigo Jones's 2 trips to Italy with the Earl of Arundel. Next slide, please. So that's the book, 4 books of architecture, then only available in Italian, and Inigo Jones adored his copy. Next slide, please. And this is one of Palladio's most